After going through the remaster for Baldur's Gate 2, I realized that Jade Empire is probably more foundational to the person that I became in game development than BG2 was. I think because I had a lot more leeway and freedom on this game, whereas with Baldur's Gate 2, it was Baldur's Gate 1 only more and better. This was a new game using existing technology, but a new game in a new direction with a lot of new things going on. So I was able to establish myself more fully as a leader. In the credits, we still haven't moved to full page credits, but I appear in the first 5. Welcome back to Memories and Lessons. We're going to move on from the Infinity engine, where we made Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, to the Aurora engine, an engine that was used to make a lot of different games. After making the demo reel for Five Fingers of Death, we actually decided that, we were going to make this Kung Fu themed game, but rather than make it in the Infinity engine, we were going to make it in Aurora, the engine that was being used to make Neverwinter Nights. Now, Neverwinter Nights had not shipped at this point, but the team started working on Jade Empire. So at the beginning, we were just sort of getting the lay of the land in the technology, and the team made a paper prototype for the way that the combat would work. And this was very useful because it allowed us to explore the components of a real-time hand-to-hand combat system. You have to remember, at this point in time, there was nobody at BioWare who had any experience with this kind of combat. So it let us essentially discover things like move timing, frame timing, wind-up times, windows of damage, things like this. But this paper prototype started to take on a life of its own. We had cards for it. That's how we sort of explored the space. You played it like a card game. But rules started being introduced in this card game, which had more to do with the card game than they had to do with any game that we would ultimately make. I think there's a dual lesson, but I'll put it down as one point, which is that paper prototypes are useful. They can be incredibly useful, especially in helping you explore a space you don't understand. But they're only useful to a point. At some point, you need to set them aside and actually get your design into code. Because as it does that, as it gets into code, as it starts to become interactive in the medium it's ultimately going to be in, you're going to realize that parts of what you thought you had discovered were wrong and that you've missed a bunch of things because the mediums are different, and that is going to change and mutate what you've learned. Around the same time, this paper prototype was starting to get a little bit overblown. Neverwinter was starting to get closer to ship, and Neverwinter was a game that was supposed to include a DM client. This was supposed to be essentially another way to play the game where you were a dungeon master and you were able to control the game experience for the other people playing the game. But this didn't exist at all, so they pulled me off of lead programmer on Jade Empire to help them write this DM client. I'm actually the person who wrote the initial DM client for Neverwinter Nights. My initial implementation was pretty simple. It's basically just a series of nested lists. I don't know that I'm going to have a lot of other UI lessons in this series, but I will say this one is that sometimes a nested list is fine. The DM client that I implemented, the one that's still in there today, is essentially 2 nested lists, one that allows you to spawn things, one allows you to browse through other things, and then a series of what are effectively contextual nested lists when you interact with objects in the world. Neverwinter had this neat radial menu system for contextual menus where it would pop up 8 things and then it could have a series of nested radial menus. But again, that's really just a series of nested lists, just lists where there's a maximum of 8 things per level. I think we can engineer our solutions. And when you don't have anything, something simple, something quick to implement gets something in the game and plants a flag in the ground that allows you to iterate from. And at the end of the day, sometimes actually nested lists is all you want. After Neverwinter shipped, I came back onto Jade Empire. Jade Empire picked back up again. I was the lead programmer on this project, and this is the first time that I really was responsible for any significant amount of scheduling. And I think this is the time when I became convinced in top-down scheduling over bottom-up scheduling. At this point in time, we were scheduling, or at least I was scheduling by using an Excel spreadsheet that I would make boxes in of the number of days that a person would be working on something. So if someone was going to be working on the damage system and that was estimated to take 15 days, you made a 15-day sized box and you basically played this weird, incredibly boring game of Tetris as you move things around in order to try to build a schedule that made sense. One of the things that happened during this is you would have things where you would have very high volumes of something, say game effects, with a relatively small estimate. So say a game effect takes a day, but you have 200 of them. So in this case, you would make a single box to represent that time. But what you have here is a really unstable box, a really unstable time estimate, because if you change that time estimate for game effect from 1 day per effect to 2 days per effect, then you've just doubled your time. Or if you drop it down to half a day, you've just halved your time. So how accurate can your estimate possibly be there? What I found more useful for me was to go top down, and rather than think about it in terms of each element takes X time, you have Y elements, X times Y is the amount of time you take, was to consider it more from a totality of effort, more top down. So does it make sense that you are going to have a single programmer spend 6 months working on game effects? Oh, actually, yeah, that does kind of make sense. Does it make sense that you would have him working on game effects for an entire year? No, that doesn't really make sense. Does it make sense that you would have him only working for 3 months? No, again, that doesn't make sense. So you get this kind of rough block of time. Over my 23 years, what I found is that these top-down broad schedules give you more accuracy often than incredibly precise bottom-up schedules. A bottom-up schedule gives you precision, but precision without accuracy is just a number with a lot of decimal points telling you that you have a 1.21324973% chance of getting eaten by a polar bear is precise, but it's not accurate. I just made that number up. Better to use the much less precise but much more accurate statement that you're very, very unlikely to be eaten by a polar bear. In my experience, bottom-up schedules end up being that. They end up sacrificing accuracy for precision, whereas top-down schedules are able to maintain some level of accuracy. They don't have precision. They can't tell you how many game effects you're going to have. They can't tell you exactly to the day when you're going to finish the game effects, but they can tell you you're going to have about 1 engineer's worth of game effects, and that's about right. Let me put a cap on these 2 points by saying this. There is a purpose for bottom-up schedules, but they take a lot of time, and I feel like the time that they take and the precision that they come with cause them to be treated with more respect than the top-down schedule that takes very little time to make, but ultimately is often more accurate. So the lesson is to use both kinds of scheduling, respect the accuracy that comes with that top-down schedule, and don't discard it simply because it was able to be made really quickly, while the bottom-up schedule took days or weeks or even months to create. During Jade Empire, we had some issues with tools. The tools development became focused so heavily on data integrity and the ability for the tools to survive various things that would cause their data to become corrupted that it became very difficult for new tools to come into being. And what I would say here is tools need to exist to be helpful. A tool that has lower data integrity is better than a tool with perfect data integrity that doesn't exist. What can happen is that leadership of specific areas can become so focused on on one particular metric that they lose sight of the overall goals of the project. It's important to remember for everyone on the team to remember that everyone should be a game developer first and their specific discipline or specialization second. If you are focusing too much on data integrity or the exact color balance of a particular cinematic scene, and by doing that, you're compromising the ability of the project to complete, you've lost sight of the goals that you should have, which are to make a good game. I would say this connection is particularly vital on the more central teams, like tools or online systems, where the ability to draw a direct connection from the work that you're doing to the game shipping can be difficult, and it can become tempting to introduce new KPIs that start to override the delivery of the game itself. It's critical to fight against this because if you don't, central teams that are critical for the success of the game can become so bogged down in their own metrics and excellence that they are no longer providing the service that the game development team needs. Sometimes this happens because you get something that's sort of like caretaker leadership. Leadership changes and the new leader is parroting or echoing the leader that came before. But while that original leader understood the reasons behind why something was important and therefore could also understand the reasons under which it would be acceptable or desirable to set aside those goals, the new leader might not understand that. So all they can do is parrot back the reasons. And this can lead to very dogmatic, very stubborn, very unwilling to change leadership, which can cause these problems. On Jade Empire, we had a custom chest opening animation. You would bend over, reach down, and open up the chest in a very well animated sequence. You didn't see this very often in games of the time, but in order for this animation to play, you needed to be standing precisely in front of the chest. So the first thing, if you clicked on a chest to open it, the first thing that Jade Empire had to do was move you in front of the chest. But the pathfinding in Jade Empire wasn't that great, and this required pretty high precision. So in order to play this chest opening animation, the first thing you had to do was a very awkward shuffle or twitching in order to get into the right position to open the chest. And then you would play a high fidelity chest opening animation. But the end result isn't very good because it's a high fidelity piece of content attached to a very low fidelity piece of content. And the lesson here is that balanced fidelity is incredibly important. In your art, you want a consistent texel density. In your animation, you want a consistent level of flow. This is particularly important for content that sits right beside other content. You're going to have different pieces of your game at different levels of fidelity, and that's good. But when a high fidelity piece sits right beside a low fidelity piece, that contrast becomes particularly visible. I think this is related to what I talked about with tools, in that you need to keep in mind the overall goals of the project and that this is about the game as a whole, not any one discipline. Jade Empire used the Aurora engine, which was designed to ship Neverwinter Nights. It was used also for KOTOR, but Jade was pushing the engine a lot further than KOTOR was. One of the consequences of using a PC-centric engine on a console is we didn't really have the best control over our memory, and levels had a tendency to leak memory as they went. This got bad enough that after you had done several area transitions, the Xbox would actually run out of memory and crash. But on the original Xbox, something you were actually allowed to do was restart the entire console. I don't think they expected people to do what we ended up doing, but it didn't violate cert. So Jade Empire actually, every single time you do an area transition, reboots the entire Xbox and then loads a save game in the new area that you're transitioning to. This cleans up memory and puts the game into a clean, stable state again. Obviously not so great for load times because it is injecting a hardware restart into the process, but it got things done. It got the game shipped. And I've said this before, and I will say it again here. Sometimes the brute force solution is okay because it gets things done. It gets the game shipped. As long as we're talking about KOTOR, I should mention something that happened during development of Jade Empire, and that's this. Often when we were running into something where people felt like the game wasn't living up to its potential, they would evoke KOTOR and say, well, why is Jade Empire doing this? Because KOTOR didn't do that. It was so much better. And I would say 99% of the time, that wasn't actually true. This was a case of people's rose-colored development goggles coloring the way that they were remembering that game. It got so bad that actually we got into the habit of having QA actually load up KOTOR and make a bunch of save games so that we could demand that the person saying something like this show us in KOTOR how KOTOR was so much better. And every single time, KOTOR was so much worse than what Jade Empire was actually doing. This is interesting because it's a hard one. You can get into a situation with your fans that's similar to this, where their memory of a previous game is so rose-colored that even though you are better than that game, you are not better than the memory of that game. That can be a hard one, and it's something to keep in mind, that you're not competing with your past, you're competing with the memory of your past. I could not figure out how to do this transition. We will pause for a second and say that if you are enjoying this video, please hit the like button and share it with someone else you think would also find it interesting. And with that incredibly awkward segue, we're going to move on to talk about Thofan. Jade Empire had a custom created language called Thofan. We actually hired a linguist to write the rules of Thofan, and originally all the lines that are spoken in Thofan were actually translated into this made-up language before they were recorded. But this language was created because we used alien languages in KOTOR. But in KOTOR, those alien languages were created and used for one particular reason, which was to give the writers a way to be able to change lines of dialogue really late in the day and not have to re-record. We could change a line of dialogue, switch it from English to an alien language, and just put in a random alien line. But of course, if you are creating an entire language with its own grammar and its own words and everything, you've lost this ability. You've created an alien language, you've created a foreign language, but now you can't use it as a get out of jail free card when you need to change a line of dialogue. Now at the end in Jade, we actually did do exactly that. We did on occasion write a line of dialogue and just substitute another line of Thofan in place. But it's important not to lose sight of why something exists in the first place. And the reason why alien languages existed in KOTOR was to allow for dialogue to change late in the day, whereas Thofan removed a lot of this ability. Quite late in Jade Empire's development, the combat was actually pretty fun, but it wasn't very balanced at all. Some of the styles were way more powerful than others. Some of the styles were effectively useless against certain enemies, incredibly dominant against others, and we decided that the game needed to be balanced. There were two negative consequences to this balancing effort. The first was all of the combat styles became a lot more similar to each other. The timing became more similar, the amount of damage they did became more similar, which I think removed some of that uniqueness that existed beforehand. But the other thing that happened in order to allow the styles to be more balanced is enemies started to block a lot more. This made it more balanced, but it made it a lot less fun. And I think that's the lesson, is that balance does not equal fun. In a single player game in particular, you don't need the game to be balanced. You need it to be balanced enough to not be trivial or impossible, but you don't need it to actually be balanced. It's not a PvP game. So it's important to keep in mind that you can allow unbalanced balance to exist, especially if it makes the game more fun to play. As Jade Empire was in CERT, a transformer at the building we were at actually exploded. I remember smoke pouring out of the parking lot that morning, probably very toxic smoke. We very quickly moved about 12 of us next door into a ballroom of the Delta Hotel. And the building was shut down for about a week. But even after the building was reopened, those of us who were highly focused on the shipping of Jade Empire stayed over there. I've long said that I think this was actually critical to Jade's ability to ship, because what it did was it isolated the people that were focused on certification and the final bugs that needed to be fixed from the rest of the team and allowed them to focus on the critical issues. I have often advocated for trying to recreate this kind of environment. I don't suggest that you set your studio on fire as you're shipping, but I do think that some form of protection of the critical parts of your team can be helpful. I've never done it to as extreme of a level as we were forced to do on Jade Empire, but I think that maybe one of the reasons that I like war rooms, why I moved triage into a meeting room in the final days of a project, might be an effort on my part to recreate this environment where focus is higher and there is a sense of isolation a little bit on the people that need to be focused on the shipping process. If you can pull it off, I highly recommend it. I do think it was very helpful in the process of Jade Empire shipping. Jade Empire was originally an Xbox exclusive published by Microsoft. Our marketing was done by a group at Microsoft called Central Marketing. I guess I don't really have a lesson here. I just wanted to say Central Marketing because to me that sounds like the department that John Wick works for when you have a problem. You call in Central Marketing. Jade Empire came out in April of 2005. And then we started to work on Jade Empire 2, still using the Aurora engine. And, I think there were some really interesting early work being done there. I started the process of changing the streaming system in a way that I believe would have allowed Jade Empire 2 to actually have had no load screens. As Jade Empire 2 was starting up, it actually pivoted and switched into something a little bit different, which was Jade Empire Modern. This would be a continuation of the original Jade Empire, assuming you took the relatively secret third ending where magic was actually suppressed. This would be set in a future where you chose that ending, magic was suppressed, and now was starting to leak back into the world. You were going to play a member of the Crisis Response Unit, or CRU, that would effectively be the Jade Empire Modern's version of the FBI. And you would uncover this conspiracy to suppress magic and eventually get your own magical powers as they returned into the world. At the time Jade Empire 2 was starting up, we actually had 4 different tech streams on the go. There was Aurora, which we just used to ship Jade Empire and was planned to be used to ship Jade Empire 2. There was Unreal 3 that was being used to make Mass Effect 1. Unreal 3 at this point had not actually shipped a game yet. There was TAG, which was an engine research group. And then there was the engine that was being developed to make Dragon Age. Through a series of, let's say, political shenanigans, TAG and Dragon Age were merged together into what would become the Eclipse engine. An unintended side effect of this was that BioWare also decided to merge Jade Empire 2 and Mass Effect together under the Unreal engine. This meant that the work that had already been done on Jade Empire 2 was thrown out, and Jade Empire was therefore essentially reset. Was this the right call? Well, we were in a situation at BioWare at this time where we probably had too many irons in the fire. There were too many different directions of technological investigation all going on at once. So something needed to change. I'm not convinced that moving Jade Empire onto Unreal was the right call, not because Aurora was an amazing piece of technology, but because it was prepared to ship a game game, whereas Unreal at the time wasn't. Mass Effect went on for quite a while before it managed to get its technology into a state to ship, and ultimately Jade Empire 2 or Jade Modern or Revolver never actually shipped at all. I'll talk about Revolver in a separate video at a later date. Merging Dragon Age and TAG together probably was the right call. They needed the technological oomph on Dragon Age, let's say, to get that game out. And BioWare simply didn't have enough people in order to have all of these different technological streams. So unfortunately, while I wish that Jade Empire 2 had been made, I think it set the studio on the road towards being more focused, and so therefore it was probably the right call, even though it meant in the end that Jade 2 never happened. Wow, I'm obviously carrying a lot more baggage with regards to Jade Empire 2 than I realized. Let's pull a lesson kicking and screaming out of my psyche. The lesson, I think, of this period is this: you can't do everything, and the sooner you can realize you can't do everything and stop doing the things you can't afford, the more focused you can be and the more attention you can pay to the most important things that you should be doing. As we were restarting Jade Empire 2 on the Unreal Engine, I realized that I needed to get my hands dirty to understand this engine better. So I actually asked for that specifically, but rather than moving me on to Mass Effect to get a little experience, then come back onto Jade Empire, I was made stream architect of both projects at the same time. This wasn't really what I was looking for. It wasn't really a role that had a clear definition at all. It didn't accomplish what I was looking for. I wasn't working directly in the code, and it didn't help me in the understanding of the Unreal Engine. So after a relatively short time as stream architect, the handheld group actually started up at BioWare. This was the group that was going to make a game for the Nintendo DS. And being pretty unhappy as stream architect and it not really fulfilling what I was looking for, I asked to transfer onto that project as their lead programmer. I would be remiss talking about Jade Empire if I didn't talk about one specific thing that actually happened after Jade Empire came out. So Jade Empire came out in 2005. In 2008, a movie came out called Kung Fu Panda. Now, Kung Fu Panda is also a movie based upon the myths and legends of ancient China, like Jade Empire. And when it came out, I remember myself and many other people on the project being shocked at how similar the art direction was between Jade Empire and Kung Fu Panda, to the point of thinking that they must have stolen it from us. From the future here, 13 years later, I don't think that was the case at all. I think this is just a case of convergent design. When you start from the same source material, you are likely to end up with similar looking results. Indeed, I would say that I kind of wish Jade Empire had been more like Kung Fu Panda, taken the whimsy further, tried something more experimental to make the material more accessible. I'll talk about this here because ultimately Jade Empire 2 and Revolver ended up being a different thing. Jade Empire has been accused of being culturally appropriative, and I think this is a fair criticism. I think that there is cultural appropriation in Jade Empire. I mean, kind of obviously, it's built by a bunch of guys in northern Canada, and it's based upon the myths of a totally different culture. Looking at that from where I stand today, I think that I wouldn't make that game today without a very different approach. So I guess maybe this is a roundabout answer to the question of whether or not there will ever be a Jade Empire 2. More direct answer would be this: EA has a studio in Shanghai, and I could imagine a scenario, a world where with guidance from BioWare Edmonton, EA Shanghai could build another Jade Empire game. I don't believe it would be appropriate for BioWare Edmonton to build that game alone, but I think that something potentially really special could be made if there was a collaboration between the studio that built the original game and a studio that understood the cultural context much better and could make something more appropriate. Is any of that likely to happen? I doubt it. I doubt that such a collaboration will occur, but I would love for that universe to be explored further by a team
that could do it justice. Okay, I think that's it for Jade Empire. Next up will be my time in the handheld group working on Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. If you did, please give this video a like, share it with other people.
A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have merch now. If you're interested in picking something up, there should be a shelf below the video. If you found this video interesting, give it a thumbs up because that will tell YouTube to share it with other people. Unfortunately, I don't think there will ever be a Jade Empire 2, but maybe there's an opportunity for a deep remake or remaster built by EA Shanghai. So if anyone from EA is listening and they want to give EA Shanghai a shot, maybe a remake of Jade Empire built out of Shanghai is a good way to give them an opportunity to try something out. And then if they do that well, maybe they take over the franchise. I will see you again soon. Thank you.